Hello everybody, Adrian Plass here,
Yes, and Bridget, hello.
and I think this is number 142 in Sounding the Shadows. We never thought we would go on this long, did
No.
we? Yeah.
But last week we said we couldn't think of any significance whatsoever
Yeah.
about number 141, and interestingly, we had somebody make a connection.
Well, it's
with
a gentleman with a
141.
very interesting and unusual mind, I think,
Yes.
who is able to find connections where the rest of us can't. And he made the point, and he did say there may not be a connection per se, but that in 141 AD, right, there was also a major earthquake in Lycia, also in what is now Turkey, and neighbouring provinces, and in the process, Myra, which was the home of St. Nicholas, was destroyed. So thank you for that.
Oh,
That
absolutely.
is a connection we would never in a million years
No, but
have
how
established.
interesting,
Yeah.
and how interesting to get one more little fact in our brains, even if we will not necessarily remember it forever. We've had some. It's been an interesting week. I mean, obviously you've still got the background, haven't you, of so much tragedy in Turkey and Syria, and then in the UK a very personal tragedy for a family who've lost their wife and mother. So all those things are going on. But there's been some things that have really made us think, and one made us laugh, which was another email, and it was somebody writing about how she once she was leading a service, and just before the Lord's Prayer she said, because it said in the book, let's join together now in the prayer that Jesus taught us. And after the service, apparently someone came up to her and said, what's the tortoise prayer? She said she hopes she doesn't mind, that she still thinks of the Lord's Prayer as the tortoise prayer.
It may well have become the thing in heaven now,
Yes.
that people say, have they said the tortoise prayer yet? You never know.
So nice.
There's some other things in the news. One is about censorship, and Roald Dahl, one of the most popular children's authors ever
In the world, I
in the
think.
world. Yeah. Now, what exactly is it that?
Well, I think what
people
it
are-
is that the publishers are anxious that some of the words that he used fit into this kind of shaming culture that we're not allowed to have anymore. So I know Augustus Gloop, who was always described as being fat and enormous
Yeah.
by Dahl, has just become enormous. The fat bit has gone.
Right.
I mean, the illustrations will presumably not be changed, but I gather that in another of the books, tractors are no longer black. They're described in all sorts of other ways, because
Why are
that
they
might
not black?
offend. Well, I think black, is a problem.
Why would you be?
Well, because
offended?
black is associated. These tractors are not very nice.
Oh,
put
I
it that
see.
way.
Oh, right. Yes.
But
Yes.
but I don't know. I think it really upset a lot of people, and it did upset us, didn't it? Because the idea that you take something that somebody has written and you just feel that you have the license to change it.
I think it's the thin end of a quite disturbing wedge, if I could put it like that. I mean, I understand all this, and actually, when I look back to my childhood, there were books I read that were shameful in their depiction of all sorts of things. And when I look at them now, I can't believe that the culture then was such that you just swallowed this stuff.
Well, you were rather keen on Biggles,
Well,
weren't you?
Biggles is a good example. I mean, some of the stuff in there was really dreadful in terms of racism and all sorts of other areas. But they were the Empire days, really, when he started writing, and people kind of swallowed. But the other
So what
side
do you
of
do?
all
Do you
this,
just cut it all out?
well, maybe, but the other side of it is that it's about who decides what isn't right and what is right, and in terms of art and artistic striving and self-expression, you have to be very careful about this stuff. I think one or two things have happened to me, haven't they?
Oh, yes, they have.
Yes.
One of them was in connection with something going to America, wasn't it? I seem to remember.
Yeah, it was a poem, and it was about heaven, and it mentioned Oakbeam, Sussex pubs, and the American publishers said we're going to do it, and there wasn't just me. There were several people involved in this project.
Yeah.
I mean, I wrote that poem, but that music was by others, and
Yeah.
and so I had to make the decision whether to leave that verse out, and it really went against the grain. And in fact, in retrospect, although I did, because there were a number of people involved, and I felt very bad about that. But I hate the fact that I gave in to that, and that poem came out, because it was part of what I really wanted to say.
Yeah, well, I think we might include that poem today, because there's something about Oakbeam Sussex pubs that, I mean, they're not just hard drinking establishments. They are so mellow, and they're the places. Well, let's leave what it says about it in that verse, because that kind of sums it up. And you were upset, actually. You were very upset.
I was very torn by that decision, and I do sort of regret it now. Although,
I mean, it's never easy, Adrian. I mean, when you think about the very first book that you wrote, and that was based on work that we had done with children, and you turned it into a novel of being a young, inexperienced person going into work with some very tough kids who swore. And the experience for me, you know, when I first went to work with girls in an approved school, and I remember us standing in the corridor before I had my interview, listening to the language and thinking, I don't know if I can cope with this. But because you felt that you needed to explain the effect on you.
Yeah, it wasn't just that. It was also that anyone who's ever worked with kids in care, whether it's forever, but certainly in that period in time, if there had been no swearing in it, I think they would have said quite rightly, but this is not how it is.
No.
And in fact, I included a word which offended some people, and I remember having a phone call from the local Christian bookshop from someone saying, I'm very disappointed.
That's right.
With that word. And
actually giving you the page and the line.
Right. And I said, well, have you read the rest of the book? Because in that case, that particular expression was precisely what was needed to show what a shock it was for somebody going into this world. So yeah, there was that. And what about the Bible?
Well, what about the Bible then?
Well, the Bible, I mean, if you're going to leave out of the Bible anything that might offend people's sensibilities, I think it's going to be a very slim volume.
I know.
Because there's all sorts of stuff in there.
Well, there is. And I mean, I struggle. I struggle with some of the things Jesus said. I don't like the fact that at the end of some of his stories, you know, you've got gnashing of teeth and being hurled into darkness. I'd rather they weren't there. I'd rather Jesus had a nice, you know, quiet finale to some of his stories. But you have to accept the whole, surely. And of course, I mean, one of the extraordinary things about the story of Christianity is that Peter and then Paul preached the cross. The one thing you'd think they might like to leave out.
Yeah, Paul said, I preached the Jesus and him crucified. Yeah, he preached the cross. That's absolutely right. It nags at me, this whole thing. I really don't know quite what to make of it. We get emails from people who suffered a lot from this kind of thing.
We do, but just before we come on to them, I mean, something else, you know, we said about the news affecting us, and I don't know, I'd be fascinated to know what other people think about this, but this whole the Scottish National Party thing about the person who was the finance minister and who is now putting herself forward to be the leader, Kate Forbes. Now, she's losing support at the moment because of some of the things she's supported in the past and some of the things she would say now. And her argument is, okay, I mean, I know that she made some anti-abortion comments at a prayer breakfast in 2018 that's been hung on to. And then she was one of 15 politicians to sign a letter calling for the delay of the Gender Recognition Act reform. And she would say that for her personally, within her faith, she doesn't believe in a church gay marriage. Now, whatever we think about those things, it's terrifying to think that she's not able to say the things or believe or stand for the things
before
that
people
she believes.
send us letters about this, if they want to, we are not talking about what we think or what we believe.
No.
We're talking about the right of people to say what they believe and think, and not have it simply knocked down because others don't agree with them.
Well, that's right.
And I think, in fact, she said, didn't she, that the law is the law, and if the law becomes the law, I will abide by the law.
Yeah, and the law is that obviously we know the law that gay people can now get married. And I know that's a hugely important thing for a lot of people who are gay, that they can actually legally be married.
Yeah.
And she made it very clear that because it's legal, she will accept that completely. But she also said that you have to be careful because we want to promote people of different cultures and different faiths. Well, if we really want to do that, we have to allow that they are going to have different views, and sometimes stronger views about some of these issues than we might even have.
Yes, I think you need to go back to the thing we've often quoted by Lionel Blue, don't you? Where he said, Judaism is my home, not my prison, or not my
that's right.
garrison. You are home where you're home with who you are, and you are allowed to invite people in or visit others. The main point is kindness and restraint in dealing with other people and their views. But we've had some interesting communications lately.
Well, I was going to say, what has been so interesting is that this week, we've had several interesting emails, but just picking out two of them, they're both on the same lines of talking about how they need freedom to be able to explore faith. And one of them is somebody who's been struggling maybe all her life, and her faith is part of that painful journey. And she said, when I put in a big effort with church, my faith seemed to disappear. When I stopped church, it would gradually recover over a few years, because the church that she was in, she wasn't able to find God in it, or the God she found was horrible. She actually quotes your book, The Shadow, Dr. Adrian, as being a way of looking at the idea of even exploring at all the idea that you might reject the God who you'd been told about, who was oppressive.
Yeah. Well, we've certainly known people who have given up the God they thought they knew. I mean, we don't know the details of that particular person's
Not
life,
at all.
obviously.
No, but
we do
some things
hear
we
this.
have
I had a
experienced.
phone call last week, from someone we love very much, who's very close to us, who was saying she believes God loves her, but every time she gets involved with the church, she feels like rubbish.
Yes.
Now, I know that in that particular case, she is about as far as you can get from being rubbish.
Yes.
But there is one aspect of her life that obviously gets people makes people unkindly critical, and it really.
But I mean, I know in our own story, Adrian, there was a period of time when we were so trying to put ourselves under the authority of people who maybe were getting things a bit wrong. It's too far in the distance now, and to talk about it really. But we were pressing down all the things we were feeling and thinking because they didn't fit with what we were being told, even though there was a part of us thought, but this can't be the whole story.
Yeah.
And so in a way we were under a level of censorship, weren't we? We were being told how we should feel, how we should express it in worship, what was right and what was wrong.
And I think, and it was being done out of goodwill.
Oh, absolutely.
I remember C.S. Lewis saying, when he came to look at what theologians were saying, that he used to think, well, that can't be right. But then they're experts in that area, so they must know what they're
Yeah,
talking about.
yeah.
And you can be locked into that for a long time.
Well, of course, he was also, Adrian, if you remember in Screwtape, he was talking about the effect of being in church, and that, you know, I mean, if you remember, he was telling Wormwood that, you know, that a way to get people away from really believing is to encourage them to look at everybody in their church and
That's right,
and find and think, well, they're not all that great, you
Yeah.
know. So what is it all about? There's so many. But the other email that we had, I don't know how much of it we ought to read, really.
Well, it's a stunning piece of writing, apart from anything else. And the person who wrote it, I hope you know who it is we're talking about. But that person is in a physical situation which is absolutely unimaginable, of having to live more or less in her head.
Yes.
And this piece of writing, which I've been thinking about ever since, has a couple of things in it that have really got inside us, I think.
I mean, we've both read it several times.
That's right, yeah. Well, one of them is that she's one of the few people I've found actually saying, I love God.
Yeah.
Now, you don't hear that a lot. A lot of people we meet are worried that God doesn't love them and they don't love God. But and then I think because she feels a profound and genuine compassion for God, because he can't change the things that he wants to change in people's lives, and perhaps starting with her being in such an appalling state of health. And
yeah. I mean, she says, doesn't she, that when she was growing up, you know, that people were almost making the Holy Spirit sound like being possessed by God, that they were having these big experiences, visions and being slain in the Spirit. And she said that she desperately wanted those and didn't have them, but now she's so pleased because, like you say, she says, and I will just quote this little bit, she says, all my experiences have been gentle. They've all been basically times when God has shared his love from his heart to hers. And this is what I thought. She said, I love that God never used any of those ways.
That's
love
the
that he
coercion
never
and all the
forces,
rest of it.
never
Yeah.
controls or coerces,
Yeah.
never compromises our autonomy, freedom of will or mind, or crosses the boundary even to influence in any way apart, to share his love. And this is the bit that you
But before we
found
come to that, the interesting thing about all that is that we hear that argument many times from people, but I often don't believe it. I don't quite believe in the sincerity of it. This piece of writing is from a heart that actually believes that. And the
there's a
word that struck
isn't
me
there, in
so
this little
strongly.
bit? She says, my
And I must
experiences, are you going to read this bit?
Yeah, I must congratulate you on this writing, by the way. It's absolutely amazing. My experiences of awful, powerful people in this world are that they always seek to control, to manipulate, use their cunning to influence, and this is the word, to curate people's perception of them. And that word curate really struck me, and because I'm sure many people listening know this. Sometimes you think you know a word and what it means. You have to go and look it up to make sure you've got it right. And to curate means to select and organize what people see and perceive exactly as they want them to. And I thought about that. The problem about curation of Christian faith and Christian belief, I don't know about the other faiths because I'm not in them, but I will have to think a lot more about that and to think about what that can and often does mean. One of the great problems, of course, is that there's an old joke, isn't there, or story about the London taxi driver who his fare gets out and gives him 50p tip, and the taxi driver doesn't look too happy, and the man says, well, sorry, is that not correct? And the taxi driver says, yes, it's correct, but it ain't right. And the problem with some preaching and curation, if you like, of what is available and right for people is that it's correct, but it ain't right. So that you listen and you
Which, of
think, well,
course-
that's true, and that's true, and that's true. But what you haven't done is let the person of God, the love of God, something else enter into that, into what's being said.
Which, of course, I mean, I think we were talking about it a wee while ago, about the fact that Jesus came to fulfill the law. So, he never said the law was wrong. It was right, or it was correct, but it was not necessarily right. Well, she went on to say, I love that God is the opposite of that he goes to such great lengths not to do that. And then, as you said, talks about the restraint that it must take to not rush in to save people. I found it all very interesting, really.
And some people obviously would say, well, that's all very well, but if you knew where I was and what was happening to me, and I understand that, I felt it myself. But what has been interesting is to hear it from someone who is in this particular position, and therefore has a very, very clear and passionate view of what she's saying.
Yeah.
So really, really interesting.
It was amazing. It really was amazing, and I think it's all part of this week, this strange week of hearing again and again. And I mean, the woman in trying to become the SNP leader, I mean, I remember years ago we lived in Sussex, as we said about the pubs, but also near Brighton, and I remember a Christian friend of ours who was not able to get a counselling job because it said on her CV that she was a Christian.
That's
as
right,
simple as that.
Yeah.
And I remember her saying quite upsetly, and maybe a little bit bitterly, if I'd have been involved in crystals and strange other things, it would have been fine. So that tuning in to what we think is appropriate within our age, what we think is appropriate within our church teaching, can so often narrow down to a point that people have no freedom at all, really.
Yeah, it's a very big area, actually. And
It is. I don't know. We do touch on these things, and it's not. It's sometimes it is a little beyond us. And maybe we'll never fully understand. But one thing. That's why I love the Heaven poem, and I'd love you to maybe not read all of it, but read the verse and read the final verse, because the final verse is so important.
All right, I'll read the verse in question. When I'm in heaven, tell me there'll be friends to meet in ancient oak-beamed Sussex pubs, enfolded by the Wanton Downs, and summer evenings lapping lazily against the shore of sweet, familiar little lands, inhabited by silence or by nonsenses, the things you cannot safely say in any other place. I love those times. And the final verse is, when I'm in heaven, tell me there will be peace at last, that in some meadow filled with sunshine, filled with buttercups, and filled with friends, you will chew a straw and fill us in on how things really are. And if there is some harm in laying earthly hope at heaven's door, or in this saying so, well, have mercy on my foolishness, dear Lord. I love this world you made, and it's all I know.
So thank you for being with us, and we'll be with you again next week.